In this video, I'm going to share with you some really basic tips on how to hold your airbrush. Let's get into it right now. So we know how to hold a pencil and we know how to hold a paintbrush, and some of us might know how to hold a spray gun, but because there's so many different types of airbrushes, it's not always clear on how to best hold your airbrush. So let's start with the gravity feed airbrush. Gravity feed obviously means that you've got the cup on the top and paint's just naturally going to flow through your airbrush. As you can see here, I've got the quick connect hooked up to my hose, so totally up to you if you want to do that or not. The first thing that I like to do is wrap the air hose around my wrist like so, and then I put my finger over the trigger. You can see I've got my thumb there, but once I get completely comfortable, I tend to hold the airbrush like this. You can see my finger is sitting over the top of that trigger. I used to airbrush like this all the time, and you probably see me in some videos go back to that from time to time. However, you'll find out that by doing this action when you're pulling back on the trigger is a lot more fatigue for your finger than if you just do this, or if you get your finger in there like so and just pull back. You can even use this part, the joint of your finger, and just carefully pull back for fine detail work. It does take a little bit more getting used to, and I have to do a shout out to Drew Blair, who showed me this method a few years back when he was running his Australian tour here, and I was fortunate enough to host him. Since then I've been using that method, and I find that having your finger over the front of that trigger and pulling back makes it a lot easier to airbrush for extended periods of time. You can see my hands are grabbing hold, and if you're using two hands, that also helps to steady your airbrush. But generally, whether it's two-handed or single-handed, this is how I hold the airbrush for a gravity feed airbrush. So with this particular brush, you can tell it's also a gravity feed. The only difference is the Mac valve. It doesn't really get in my way, so I generally hold this the same way as I just showed you with the Eclipse. Sometimes I will grab hold of that Mac valve and use the airbrush like so for fine detail work, but nothing really changes with airbrushes that have that Mac valve. Now with the side feed brush, again, have that finger right over the trigger. You can see it's a lot easier to do because we don't have that cup in the way. The cup is actually on the side. And a quick note, I'm sure everyone that owns one of these already knows, so you can remove this part here, switch your cup to this side and plug up the other side. So whether or not you're right or left-handed, you can put the cup on either side, whichever you prefer. Because there's no cup in the way, it makes it a lot more comfortable to have my finger resting over the trigger like so, and I can control my fine detail by just pulling back ever so slightly. If you're doing really detailed stuff, I like to use both hands to steady the airbrush. So the other style of airbrush that you'll see available is the siphon feed, meaning these types of airbrushes, instead of natural gravity allowing the paint to flow through your brush, these will suck up the paint from the glass jar, move it up through the airbrush, and then the air will propel that paint through the fluid nozzle and out the air cap. With siphon feed brushes, again, I like to have the hose resting on my wrist. It just helps with a bit of fatigue as well, especially if you're using a braided hose. And I kind of hold onto the jar whilst I'm airbrushing. So that becomes almost like a steadying device. So when I first started, I actually learnt on a Pache or Pache VL, and they are a siphon feed airbrush. So I'm quite familiar with using the cup underneath, and it definitely does feel comfortable holding onto that, and it makes it a bit more steady when you are starting to learn how to airbrush, because that is one of the main things. Because you are hovering from the surface, you're not touching like a pencil or a pen, it makes it more difficult to get used to the feeling of airbrushing and getting that control. And again, because there's no cup on the top, I'm able to just really sit my finger over the top of that trigger, which helps me to control the trigger action. If you're left-handed, you would just be doing the opposite. And for anyone that has the trigger style airbrush, I pretty much just hold it like that. I find it comfortable having my finger there, but totally up to you. You can also hold it like so. I tend to find that works for me. And one thing I think that is really important to mention is that what I'm showing you here are just my tips and what I find comfortable. At the end of the day, it's whatever works best for you. I've seen airbrush artists that use their thumb and they get amazing results. If that's comfortable for you, go for it. What I've shown you are, in my opinion, best practices, but you don't have to follow them 100%. So just do what works for you. Okay, so just putting a few of those things into practice. So when you're just fogging in, you can definitely just use one hand. If you want to do lines, then I would recommend holding the airbrush with both hands. It just makes it a lot steadier for you. And you can also use your knuckle if you want to adjust your height, or a finger. So for instance, with the knuckle you can lean up against it. You're going to get a consistent line because you're not varying your height. If you use your finger, same thing. You can get like a thicker line, and again, it's not going to vary, and it's a lot easier to keep it straight and consistent. For fine detail, go ahead and remove the air cap. Just be careful not to drop your airbrush because you could damage the needle and therefore also damage the nozzle. But by removing the air cap, this will allow you to get finer detail, and even with an airbrush like the Eclipse, I'm able to get nice fine dots, as well as really fine lines. Remember, this is a 0.35mm needle nozzle setup, and I've got my paint thinned out a little bit more. So this is a 30-70 mix, 30% paint, 70% reducer. You can see how nicely that flows. The paint that I'm using is Trident airbrush paint. So to fast track your learning, you can definitely check out our online airbrushing course at airbrushassylum.thinkific.com, or you can continue viewing some of the other videos that are listed here. And until next time, go grab your airbrush, do some amazing artwork yourself, and I'll see you again very, very soon in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.